in the Premier League era. It's a phrase you hear an awful lot when you watch Sky Sports and either live games or analysis. And it really grates with me because obviously in the Premier League era is from 1992, and it's almost like football didn't exist before 1992, and yet they still cherry pick things that they want from pre 1992. So what's kind of grated me this time is Jamie Carragher did Monday Night Football last night after the Everton United game, and with Van der Sar they'd gone through the best 10 goalkeepers in Premier League history, and Neville Southall was at eighth position. Now, Neville Southall was a weird one because the majority of his career was spent outside of the Premier League, i.e. the First Division, with a very successful Everton team of the mid to late 80s. Now, it's not to say that the Neville Southall from 92 onwards was a terrible goalkeeper. He wasn't. But listening to Jamie Carragher's rationale of why Neville Southall was in there, he started off by saying that, yeah, he's in there because of what he did in the Premier League. But then he really went back into what Southall had done in the 80s. And I felt that, are you really picking Southall on just his Premier League era here, which is in the Premier League era, which is the point of the list, or are you picking Southall on the what he'd done in his career? I mean, personally, I wouldn't have had Southall in the top 10 of a Premier League era goalkeeper list. But as Carragher rightly pointed out, if it was to include the First Division, then yeah, Neville Southall would be right up there, and I would agree with that. But this is where I've always had a problem with Sky Sports. And it filters outwards as well. I can remember a number of years ago when Haaland was, scoring goals for fun. And I think it was around the January or February, and they said he could break the all-time goal-scoring record, in the league. And I went, he's not that close to 60 goals, is he? And he wasn't. But he was close to, in terms of the goals he was scoring across all competitions. So obviously Dixie Dean for Everton holds that distinction of 60 goals in a season. So Haaland was nowhere near that. But what filtered out on social media is the top scorers in all the top, in the top 5 divisions. But Dixie Dean was nowhere to be found. It was like the Premier League was taken from 1992, and all the others, I think Germany had Gerd Muller, and so this whole the Premier League era, it's very frustrating. Now, I grew up watching football from 1992. 91, 92 was my first season that I really remember, and that was the last season of the First Division. So, I'm not someone who remembers a lot, before 1992. But I do a lot of research, and I speak to a lot of people, and I watch a lot of documentaries and read a lot of books. And certain players, I think, are harshly done by with this Premier League only. So when you look at the 100 Club, it's the episodes on Sky Sports showing all the players who, in each half an hour show on each player who scored 100 or more goals in the Premier League. And there's some great players in there. But there's a lot of players who played in the Premier League who miss out on that list, who are fantastic in their own right. So let's start with the most obvious, Ian Rush. Liverpool's all-time top scorer, hugely successful for Liverpool. But his Premier League, obviously, by the time the Premier League comes, he's not the force he was, and obviously ends up with Leeds and Newcastle. But he's not going to get in the 100 Club. But he should have a show, just for him, because how you can ignore a player now? Liverpool fans would remember, should know Ian Rush. Yes, they can talk about Salah, etc., but Ian Rush is the all-time top goal scorer. So in any conversation of like who's the best striker, even just for Liverpool, he should be right. Well, he should be right up there. Brian Robson for United. Again, most of his career was like 70s for mid to late 70s for West Brom, and then 80s for United. And obviously he did win a Premier League title in 92-93. But again, you know, he wasn't the mainstay of the team, but he was Mr. United throughout the 80s. He was England's main midfielder, you know, and only injuries, both in 86 and 90, really stopped him and England progressing even further than they did in both tournaments. But he, you know, there's been a big debate recently about, you know, kind of silly at the moment with Declan Rice being better than Gerrard or Lampard and all of this. And then it's like, but where does Brian Robson come in? You know, so Neville Southall, as I've said, should be, you know, not 8th on the list of best goalkeepers. You know, he should be. I'd take prime Southall over prime De Gea any day of the week. Now, you obviously might disagree, but I think it's frustrating, as I say, for when they come up with these stats, since 1992, and yet they go, but Liverpool have won 20 titles, and you're like, right, so you pick whatever you want from 1992, but we'll include Liverpool's first division titles, or we'll include Man United's first division titles, you know, and this is kind of what grates me. And I get that Sky Sports and Premier League is a product, and you know, when they introduced it in 1992, it was a whole new ball game. It was packaged differently, you know, but we run the danger of repeating history constantly, because I reckon if you've gone back to the 1990s, there'd be people saying, but you've forgotten the great players of the 60s or the 50s. And, you know, the debate would go back. So in the 1960s, they'd be like, but you've forgotten the great players of the, you know, just the pre-Second World War era. So I think this is an argument that goes on consistently, because you may not think it, but in 20 years' time, you know, when some of you are watching this are my age and a bit older, people will start comparing players of, you know, of 20 years' time and ignoring players you thought, well, hold on, he was one of the best. And they'll start going, oh, yeah, but that was 20 years ago. So it's an argument that repeats itself constantly. But I think where this is different to me is, if you watch a lot of football documentaries and a lot of football histories that were produced in the late 80s into the 90s, they talk about post-war records, so post-Second World War records. And you can kind of understand that, because there was a big gap between, you know, the 39-40 season ended literally within 2 to 3 games. And then league football didn't resume until 46-47. So there was a massive gap between, you know, one season being played and the next season. But football didn't take a massive break between the end of the 91-92 season and then, you know, the same, and then into the 92-93 season. You know, it wasn't like teams suddenly got rid of loads of players and then got brought in loads more. It was the same basic squads that had finished the 92 season, obviously with a few transfers. So there's not this massive gulf between the First Division era and the Premier League era, you know, in terms of when the First Division finished and the Premier League started. And I think it does a massive disrespect to football in general that you start ignoring players and say in the Premier League. Now, again, people can argue, but we're, you know, 30 odd years, well over 30 odd years, you know, into the Premier League. So it's not like the Premier League started 4 or 5 years ago. But as I say, it's just a massive disservice. Now, older names do get mentioned, you know, but I've seen again today, an all-time Manchester United 11. Bruno Fernandes is in there. Debatable. Bobby Charlton is not in there. George Best is not in there. Basically, anybody before 1992 that had played for Manchester United was not in that team. And you think, but yeah, someone's put that together, AI in this case, but that's the danger. And of course, you know, clubs of individual, you know, like United fans, I mentioned Liverpool fans earlier, they should remember their own greats. Of course they are. And some greats will, you know, go across multiple generations. So whenever you see a great England team mentioned, most of the time it will have Bobby Moore as centre-back. I'm not 100% sure that's always justified. Now, that is a whole nother debate. But Bobby Moore for England, yes. Bobby Moore for West Ham, but that, as I say, so Bobby Moore will always go across, multiple generations. If you see an England team without Bobby Moore in defence, I'm wary of, have they even looked at pre-1992? But does this grate with anyone else? I mean, for younger fans, it might not. I generally grew up. If there was a football program, Saint and Greavesy, when I was growing up, and I saw a fat balding man, quite funny, as one of the presenters, Greavesy. I had no idea, So I'm kind of 6, 7, 8 at this point. I'm not really fully into football yet. I've got no idea who this Greavesy is. To me, he's a fat bald guy. Yeah, he talks about football, and St John, not quite sure. I learned who St John was relatively quickly because we had an old Liverpool history, that went up to 1988, and obviously he was I think Ian St John, quite a key part of Bill Shankly's first building of Liverpool. But Jimmy, this big guy Greavesy, it didn't hit me for a couple of years who Greavesy was, because this was like, the First Division's all-time top scorer, and if you include the Premier League, he's English football's all-time top league goal scorer, Jimmy Greaves. He only missed out on the World Cup because he missed a game through injury, and then he just didn't get back in the team. So he didn't have that level of achievement that, Geoff Hurst has, for example. Obviously, I know he scored a hat-trick, but Greaves was in that team at the beginning of the tournament. He played for some fantastic clubs, won a lot of, trophies, with Tottenham especially, played in Milan for AC as well. So I can understand why people of every generation look back at people from 30, 40 years ago going, yeah, but football was different then, and it was probably easier and all of this. And that's not true. Football is football at the end of the day, and, goal scorers is probably the best thing. The hardest thing to do in football is put the ball in the back of the net. I don't care what people say about, but, Dixie Dean scored 60 goals, but that was in, the early 30s. That probably wasn't the hardest time. Well, have a look at Dixie Dean in terms of what he had to go through before he got to that season. You'll be surprised. A lot of players would have retired, for his off-field injuries. So I just don't like this in the Premier League era, because I think that does a massive disservice to a lot of great players who straddled both eras, but probably had their prime in the 80s and early 90s. And there's so many players I could have mentioned who played in the Premier League, but are never mentioned as one of the best in the Premier League era. So I'm just going to name a few: Stuart Pearce, Des Walker, John Barnes. They're just a few that spring to the top of my mind that, again, played mainly in the 80s, but still when it, played in the Premier League. But what do you think? Does it even matter? Do you even care? Does it, if you came into football like me in 92 or 2002 or whenever, does it matter what people did 40, 50 years ago? Just, or does it grate you as well? So obviously let me know in the comments, and if you like the content I've been producing over the last kind of couple of weeks, obviously like and subscribe. That would be really helpful. And yeah, so